biting wind howled, a relentless predator stripping the last vestiges of warmth from the skeletal trees. Snow, an endless shroud, buried the land under an unforgiving white, stretching from the distant, bruised horizon to the very edge of the small, desolate cabin. Within its meager walls, Elara shivered, not just from the cold that seeped through every chink and crack, but from a deeper, more profound chill that had settled in her bones days ago. Her mother, gone. Not vanished into thin air, but walked away, leaving only a frayed shawl and the crushing weight of silence. Elara, no more than 12, but with eyes that had seen too much, clutched a small, crudely carved wooden bird, the last gift. The cabin had been her mother's, their temporary refuge on the edge of nowhere, a place of last resort. Now it was just hers, and the silence was a deafening roar. Days bled into one another, marked only by the dwindling firewood and the gnawing ache of hunger. Desperation, a cold, hard knot in her belly, finally propelled her out into the unforgiving white. She had seen the smoke, faint but persistent, rising from beyond the ridge, a beacon in the vast emptiness. Hope, frail as a dying ember, flickered. Her small, ill-fitting boots sunk deep into the drifts, each step a monumental effort. The air tore at her lungs, sharp as shattered glass. She focused on the distant wisp of gray, a singular point of purpose in a world consumed by an indifferent white. Hours later, when her legs were screaming and her fingers numb with cold, the cabin emerged from the swirling snow, a solitary, sturdy shape against the darkening sky. It was larger than hers, built of rough-hewn logs, smoke curling lazily from its stone chimney. A dog, a hulking black shadow, rose from the porch, its low growl a rumbling warning that vibrated through the frozen ground. Elara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. But the dog, after a moment of intense scrutiny, settled back onto its haunches, watching her with intelligent, unblinking eyes. Taking a ragged breath, Elara pushed forward, the silence of the wilderness broken only by the crunch of her own steps. She reached the heavy wooden door, raised a trembling hand, and knocked. The sound was swallowed by the wind, but the dog stirred, its tail thumping a slow, hesitant rhythm against the wood. The door creaked open, revealing a man framed by the warm glow of a fire. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind, etched with lines that spoke of a hard life. His eyes, the color of a winter sky before a storm, regarded her with an unreadable intensity. He held a pipe, its cherry glow a small, comforting light in the deepening twilight. He didn't speak, simply waited, his gaze unwavering. Elara felt a fresh wave of fear, but beneath it, a desperate resolve. She looked up at him, her small face streaked with dirt and tears, her voice a reedy whisper against the wind's shriek. Can you help me find my mama?" The words hung in the frigid air, fragile and full of an aching hope. The man's expression did not change. He took a slow draw from his pipe, the smoke curling around his face like a veil. Then he looked past her, out into the swirling snow, as if searching for something only he could see. He didn't offer comfort or even a direct answer. Instead, his gaze returned to her, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. The door remained ajar, an invitation or a challenge, she couldn't tell. But the warmth spilling from within was undeniable. It promised a temporary reprieve from the relentless cold, a fragile moment of safety she desperately needed. Her body ached, her spirit was bruised, but the flicker of hope, though faint, refused to die. Caleb simply watched her, his pipe held loosely in his hand. Her question, raw and laced with the desperate ache of a child abandoned, hit a chord he rarely acknowledged. He was a man of the mountains, a solitary figure who had long ago shed the messy entanglements of human connection. His life was hard-won, carved out of the unforgiving wilderness, and he preferred it that way. He saw the tremble in her thin frame, the faint blue of her lips, the haunting depth in her eyes that belied her tender age. She was a trespasser, an intrusion, a complication he neither wanted nor needed. He considered turning her away, letting the unforgiving land reclaim what it would. But something in her unwavering gaze, a stubborn resilience flickering beneath the fear, held his words unspoken. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood, observing, the warmth of his cabin a silent lure. After a long moment, the girl, interpreting his stillness as a tentative invitation, shuffled forward, stepping over the threshold. The dog, Black, nudged her hand with his nose, a soft, almost imperceptible gesture of acceptance. Caleb watched her move towards the fire, drawn to its heat like a moth to a flame. He closed the door, shutting out the storm and the world outside. The first few days were a study in silent observation. Alara, still raw from her mother's departure, moved with a cautious quietness, her small shadow clinging to the edges of the firelight. Caleb, in turn, remained a man of few words, his gruff practicality a constant presence. He offered her food, a simple stew, fresh-caught fish without preamble, setting it before her with a nod. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, her eyes rarely leaving his face, trying to decipher the unreadable depths within them. He watched her from across the cabin, his gaze sharp, assessing. He saw how she flinched at sudden movements, how her eyes held a haunted look when she thought he wasn't looking. But he also saw a resilience that surprised him. She didn't complain, didn't cry. She simply existed, a quiet, watchful presence in his solitary world. He went about his daily routine, chopping wood, mending traps, cleaning his rifle. Alara, after a day of hesitant watching, began to help, unasked. She fetched water from the well, her small hands struggling with the heavy pail. She learned to sort firewood, separating the dry kindling from the larger logs. She even attempted to mend a tear in his worn coat, her fingers clumsy but determined. Caleb noticed these small acts, his expression never changing, but a silent acknowledgement passed between them, a fragile thread woven from shared tasks and unspoken needs. One afternoon, he found her staring out the small window, her brow furrowed, a faint whisper escaping her lips. "Manga." He heard it, the soft, yearning sound, and for a fleeting moment, a shadow crossed his weathered face. He didn't offer words of comfort, for he had none to give. Instead, he simply walked to the workbench, picked up a piece of seasoned wood, and began to carve. Alara, turning from the window, watched him, fascinated. Slowly, meticulously, a small bird began to take shape under his skilled hands, its wings curved as if in flight. It was an unspoken offering, a quiet acknowledgement of her grief, a fragile bridge between their two worlds. As the days turned into weeks, a routine, an unspoken rhythm, settled between them. The cabin, once a bastion of Caleb's solitude, now held the quiet hum of two lives intertwined by circumstance. Alara's fear began to recede, replaced by a tentative curiosity, a budding sense of belonging. She learned to identify the calls of various forest creatures, to track deer prints in the snow, to distinguish edible berries from poisonous ones, all under Caleb's quiet tutelage. He never explained, only showed, his actions speaking volumes where words would have fallen short. The little wooden bird he had carved now sat on the rough-hewn table, a constant reminder of his quiet kindness. One evening, a fierce blizzard raged outside, rattling the cabin walls, a primal roar that made the small space feel even more vulnerable. Alara, curled by the fire, watched Caleb as he checked the fastenings on the door, his movements deliberate and strong. He was a pillar of quiet strength, a bulwark against the wild. For the first time, she felt a profound sense of safety, a feeling she hadn't known since her mother's departure. She looked at him, truly looked at the lines around his eyes, the set of his jaw, the gentle way he stoked the fire. He was not her mother, but he was here, and that, in itself, was a miracle. The question of Mama still occasionally surfaced in her dreams, a phantom ache, but in her waking hours, a new reality was taking root, firm and undeniable. The deep winter held them captive, But it also forged something resilient between Alara and Caleb. Their connection, born of necessity, deepened through unspoken understanding. Then the real threat came. Not the predictable fury of the storm, but the insidious cruelty of man. It was a cold, gray morning when Caleb spotted the telltale sign. A fresh, crude trap set too close to their usual hunting grounds, not for game, but unmistakably for his own valuable pelts. He knew the type, desperate men driven by hunger and greed, the kind who respected no boundaries. He told Alara nothing directly, but his movements became sharper, his eyes more vigilant, constantly sweeping the tree line. Alara, attuned to his subtle shifts, sensed the change. The air in the cabin grew taut with an unspoken tension. A few days later, while Caleb was out checking his traps, a shadow fell across the cabin door. Alara, sorting dried herbs by the fire, froze. The sound of heavy footsteps outside, closer than Black's familiar tread. The dog, usually a watchful sentinel, was out with Caleb. A rough hand tried the latch, then another, harder. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird. She scrambled under the rough wooden table, pulling the worn cloth around her, her breath catching in her throat. The door splintered inward with a loud crack, revealing two hulking figures, faces shadowed by wide-brimmed hats, eyes glinting with a cold, predatory light. They swept the small cabin with their gazes, muttering to each other in low, guttural tones. One of them kicked over a pail, sending water sloshing across the floor. "Empty," he grunted, disappointment lacing his voice. "Man's out." The other was already moving towards the back, towards Caleb's meager stores. Just as the second man reached for the pantry door, a guttural snarl ripped through the air, and Black, a black blur of fury, launched himself into the room, a growling, teeth-baring missile. The first man cried out as Black latched onto his arm, dragging him back. Before the second man could react, Caleb filled the doorway, his silhouette imposing, his rifle held steady. There was no hesitation, no wasted movement. A single, sharp command to Black. A low warning growl from Caleb. The intruders, caught between the snarling dog and the unwavering barrel of a rifle, knew they were outmatched. With curses and clumsy retreats, they scrambled back out into the snow, melting into the gray light of the forest. Alara emerged from under the table, trembling, her eyes wide with fear and a dawning understanding. Caleb stood over her, his rifle still aimed at the now empty doorway, his face grim. When he finally lowered the weapon, his gaze met hers. There was no need for words. She saw the quiet protectiveness in his eyes, the stark reality of the danger they faced together. She wasn't just a child he harbored. She was part of his world, and he would defend it. In that moment, something shifted within Alara. The lingering fragility of the abandoned child began to harden, replaced by a steely resolve. She looked at the splintered door, then at Caleb, and a quiet strength settled in her features. This wasn't just his fight. It was hers too. She would not be a burden. She would be a partner. The question of her mother, once a desperate plea for rescue, now felt distant, a fading echo. Her safety was here, with this silent, formidable man and his loyal dog, in this small, sturdy cabin against the vast, indifferent wild. She realized, with a clarity that resonated deep within her, that she was no longer looking for rescue. She was building a life. Spring arrived, a slow, hesitant breath after the brutal grip of winter. The snow receded, revealing the scarred earth beneath, but also the first green shoots, fragile promises of renewal. The creek that ran near the cabin, once a frozen ribbon, now tumbled and roared with snowmelt, a vibrant song of life returning. The air carried the scent of thawing earth and new growth, a stark contrast to the sterile bite of winter. Alara, standing on the cabin porch, watched a small red fox dart across the clearing, its fur a vivid splash against the muted landscape. She was no longer the shivering, lost child who had tapped on Caleb's door. Her frame was still slight, but her movements were imbued with a quiet purpose, a newfound strength. Her eyes, once haunted, now held a watchful calm, reflecting the vast landscape they surveyed. She knew the rhythm of the land now, understood the silent language of the forest, thanks to Caleb's patient, wordless tutelage. Their days continued, a shared existence forged in the crucible of necessity. They worked side by side, preparing the garden patch, repairing the damage the winter storms had wrought, restocking the dwindling supplies. The communication between them remained sparse, a dance of unspoken understanding, of glances and gestures that conveyed more than a torrent of words ever could. Caleb, in turn, had softened, imperceptibly perhaps, but irrevocably. The rigid lines around his eyes seemed less pronounced, his formidable presence tempered by a quiet acceptance. He would often find himself watching Alara, a flicker of something akin to pride in his gaze as she handled a trapping line with growing proficiency, or deftly cleaned a fish caught fresh from the creek. She had brought a quiet light into his solitary world, a warmth he hadn't known he needed until it was there. The memory of her mother still surfaced, a soft ache, but it no longer consumed her. The desperate plea, "Can you help me find my mama?" had transformed from a literal question into a metaphorical one. She had found her mama, not in the form of the woman who had left her, but in the quiet, steadfast presence of Caleb, in the enduring strength of the land, and most profoundly, within herself. She had discovered a resilience she never knew she possessed, a deep well of courage that had seen her through the darkest days. The cabin, once a stranger's refuge, was now home. The vast wilderness, once a terrifying expanse, was now a domain she understood, respected, and even loved. One evening, as the sun dipped below the distant mountains, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and deep violet, Alara sat by the crackling fire, mending a tear in Caleb's hunting shirt. Black lay stretched beside her, his head resting on her lap, a low rumble of contentment in his chest. Caleb sat across from them, slowly cleaning his rifle, the familiar scent of oil filling the air. He looked up, his gaze meeting hers across the dancing flames. There was no need for words, no grand pronouncements. The question of her departure, of her future, had long ceased to be a question. The notion of leaving, of returning to a world she barely remembered, held no appeal. Her life was here now, inextricably bound to this man, this land. A quiet certainty settled over her, warm and undeniable. She belonged, and as the fire cast long shadows across the cabin walls, Caleb knew, with an unspoken clarity that resonated deep within his own quiet heart, that she would stay always. Their story, forged in the crucible of hardship, had become one of quiet endurance, profound connection, and the enduring power of finding family in the most unexpected of places.